Welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Hi everyone, it's Jesse Green here. Welcome back to SavvyDentist.com and to the Savvy Dentist podcast. Now my guest today is someone who I admire and respect greatly. He's a multi-practice owner, he's a really lovely guy, smart businessman, and a great mind and great philosopher when it comes to thinking about life and business together. Hwin is who I'm talking about, of course, and many people in the Australian dental community will be very familiar with Paul. And what we talk about in this particular episode is his journey to multi-practice ownership, the things he's learned, the things that have worked well, some of the things to consider if you're looking at that journey. And of course, we also talk about Paul's background. Paul grew up in a family that was, really involved in business, and he shares some of the lessons he learned, that were handed down to him as a kid, watching his parents and grandparents as they ran their own business. It's a really nice conversation. Paul's a great conversationalist. He's very generous with his knowledge, with his insight, and I'd encourage everyone to have a good listen to this because there's tons of wisdom, tons of pearls of wisdom that you can take away and apply for your own practice, of course. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed recording it. Here's Paul Hwin. My guest today is Paul Hwin, who is the founder and lead dentist at Sapphire Dentistry in Melbourne, and of course the owner of several other practices as well. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come and hang with us. How are you, mate?
I'm really well, Jesse. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Oh, mate, it's a thrill for me to have you. I'm really grateful to you. And I know we've got a lot of things we're going to be talking about today, and I can't wait to dig into those. I just want to start with, I guess, a little bit of background because typically you don't go from, nothing to multiple practices, in one easy step. I'm curious to ask a little bit about your journey, Paul. What's been the backstory? How did you get to this point?
It's a bit of a long journey, but I'll try and keep it short as much as I can. It might be a surprise to a lot of people, but actually throughout high school and even year 12, dentistry wasn't my first preference, so I didn't have any intention of actually pursuing a medical or even a dental degree at that point. And it was a dream of mine to go into commerce and study that. And, my mom at the time said to me, it's the final opportunity to go into dental school and do it in 5 years. How do you know you're going to love commerce? If you hate dentistry, you can just move into commerce and then that's the end of the story. But if you don't like dentistry, it's much harder. If you don't like commerce, it's much harder moving on from that. So I took a leap of faith, gave it a try, ended up loving it, did my 5 years of dental school, some of the best times during my life, met some great friends. And then I managed to get into a job in regional Victoria under some fantastic mentors and get an insight into what business ownership was. And my uncle, who was also a dentist, was just getting out of dentistry. And there was an opportunity to take over a practice in metropolitan Melbourne. And I guess 2 years out of dental school, I came up with that opportunity and decided to give it a shot, walked into it, not knowing what to expect, made heaps of mistakes along the way. A couple of years later, another few opportunities came up in rural Victoria. Again, jumped into that, not knowing what to expect. Made a few more mistakes and then learned a lot from that and developed from there. And here we are.
Mate, that's a really interesting story about the commerce and the dentistry. I mean, I knew you'd had other career options in front of you because we'd had that conversation privately. But I'm curious to ask, has that interest in commerce, obviously what drove you to think about the commerce in the first place, has that kind of kept you interested in the business side of dentistry as well? Is that a fascination for you?
Absolutely, Jesse. I guess I come from a family and a background where I guess I've been brought up to that business is in our blood. My grandparents had businesses of their own. My parents have owned businesses of their own. My uncles and aunties have been involved with business from the get-go. So I was kind of brought up with the idea that business is going to be as part of your life at some point, one or another. And I guess that was why I guess when I would grow up, I said, I'm going to do commerce. My sister studied commerce. My brother-in-law studied commerce. They had a great lifestyle. And so it just so happens that dentistry provides me the opportunity to not only, I guess, provide care to patients, but also be involved in the business aspect as well.
Yeah. And so you had that first opportunity at quite a young age, really. I mean, 2 years out of uni is, probably still fairly new to be getting into practice ownership. I know some people do it sooner, and that's great. There's no time that's right or wrong. I'm curious to ask you how you managed clinical development along with business ownership as well, because, 2 years out of uni, probably still developing your clinical skills as much as having to learn the business ropes as well. What was that journey like for you?
That's a really good question, Jesse. I guess in the first couple of years of my career, I was fortunate to be a part of a big practice with very progressive mentors and business owners. And I guess my clinical development in the first couple of years was, I guess, pretty rapid and quite quick. So I developed my basic clinical skills relatively quickly. And when I first jumped into the business, my focus has shifted quickly away from the clinical. And I kind of, I guess, got to a point where I said, okay, this year I'm going to focus on my business development. Yeah. And then once I kind of got a better grasp of what business ownership involves, then I can focus more on the clinical. And so I developed this habit of having a theme every year on what my growth would be like. So say, for example, my first year of business ownership, I'd be like, okay, I'm going to focus on learning what practice ownership is like. And then in my second year, I said, okay, where else can I expand that would help not only myself as in my clinical skills, but also help with the practice growth. So then in my second year, I said, okay, I'm going to spend time develop my skills in the orthodontics, in rehabilitation growth, and et cetera, et cetera. So, and that's a little bit of a habit of mine where even to this day, I have a focus every year on where I want to develop and head towards.
It's really interesting. Years and years ago, I was listening to Gordon Christensen speak, and he spoke about that exact same thing, was to have a theme for each year. And he was using the exact same method as you do. And obviously you've stumbled across that yourself, and it's something that I tend to do as well. My themes tend to be not quite to the year, though. They're probably, 13, 14, 15 months, 18 months, but
sure,
perhaps a little, maybe I need to get a bit more structure of that like you. Have a bit more discipline in that space. But I'm curious to ask you, Paul, when you jumped into the practice ownership at that young age, it's a bit of a deep end experience. You kind of sink or swim, and you obviously swam, and not only did you swim, you did very well. I want to ask you, as you went through that, what were the things that set you up for success in that early stage? What were the things that allowed your practice to not just survive, but thrive? Because there'll be people listening to this podcast who are quite young in their career and thinking about practice ownership. And they're thinking, well, am I too young? And my view is kind of, if you're good enough, you're old enough. Really, that's my view.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I really love this topic, Jesse. I feel it comes down to two things. And the first thing I'm going to say is it's about mindset. As you've just correctly pointed, it's either when you put in the deep end, you're going to either swim or you're going to sink. And I've been at different points in my life been taught that life is hard, and it's an opportunity and to view it as a glass half full or half empty situation. And I feel that understanding the pains and the aches that you go through is just a part of growth. And if anything, it will teach you resilience. And a bit of background about my practice. My practice is on a street where there's about 15, 20 other practices within a 1 to 2 kilometer radius. We were a single chair practice, and there were multi-chair practices around us. And I kind of went in saying, what have I got to lose? Preferred provider practices all around me, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, if I can make it work at this practice, I can make it anywhere. Yeah. And so that was my mindset going in. And I feel that's probably the first thing I would tell people. And the second thing is it's about the people you hang out with. I very much believe that you are the average of the top 5 people you spend time with. Yeah. And I met some really inspirational people within the first 3 to 6 months of me owning my practice. And hearing their humbling stories gave me a lot of hope in terms of what I could achieve from the practice. And I felt that learning from them would give me an opportunity to grow. And that's something that I believe to this very day. Yeah.
I love that. I just want to come back to the mindset point, Paul, because it's a really important one. And, that opportunity for growth is painful, and growing pains are part of life. Is that something that you learned by watching your family go through business? So I'm curious to ask what that family experience was like, what lessons came out of that, because for some people, they might not have had that experience of growing up in a family business or businesses like you've had. So where did that mindset come from? Is that something you developed, or is it something you observed? Where did that come from?
That comes from my parents.
Yeah.
And probably my grandparents as well, Jesse. My family came from a war-torn country, and they had to drop everything that they had and at a fairly young age actually move to a country where they didn't understand the language, the culture, and had to build their life up from scratch at the age of like 20. And my grandparents are at their late 30s at that stage. So I feel that through their own experiences with going through that and hearing their stories was a huge part of me developing, I guess, my own mindset. Secondly, through the businesses aspect, I guess what I learned from being a part of family businesses and everything is the importance of knowing when things work to run with it, but when things don't work, not to continually doing it. Otherwise, you're just banging your head up against the wall. Now, my parents and my uncles and aunties, when I observe their businesses and so on and so forth, I can see where they've made mistakes, and I've taken them as learning experiences and kind of set constraints up around the way I want to work, particularly around my lifestyle, and gone from there, if that kind of makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, mate. What is it, again, just staying on that theme of observing your family and business, what are the things that you've taken from them specifically, and what are the things that you've looked at and gone, I might try something different?
Again, I really like this topic. It's what I've noticed with my family businesses is that they were very, very key person dependent.
Yeah.
My dad used to run a restaurant, and my parents have their own little humble grocery store in metropolitan Victoria, and they are very much in the business. And they're so focused on running the day-to-day things that they can't look beyond that. And I guess the key lesson is that when you own a business, you can't be spending too much time working inside the business. And whilst it's easier said than done, we really need to be able to work on the business. And that's something that I'm sure every practice owner is aware of. Yeah. But I guess implementing and learning the skills and how to employ it is a completely different thing. So I guess I had a bit of a head start in recognizing that my parents were working too heavily inside the business.
So let's talk about making that leap, crossing that divide from going in the business to on the business, because you're absolutely right. I mean, everyone knows that, in the business versus on the business metaphor, and everyone kind of gets it and understands it. And yet it's not an easy transition to make. It's a gear change that some people master and master well, and you've done that. And other people kind of try to make that gear change, but revert back to what they know. And what they know is dentistry. And what they know is how to, control the four walls within the surgery and all that sort of stuff. So I'm curious to ask, as you've made that transition, what are the things that helped you make the transition? And again, where did you go well? And again, where did you make a couple of oopses along the way?
Yeah. So I guess when we first start out as business owners, we're just purely driven on getting patients in the door and just kind of growing. And I think usually in your first year, first 6 months to 12 months, you grow so rapidly, but you get more and more embedded in the practice. The first step in being able to work on the business is realizing that you need to slow down and step back. Yep. And I think one of the biggest lessons is actually learning to say no. So you're so keen on working 5 days and fitting patients in here and there, but in reality, you need to be maybe working 3 days or 4 days and having a day on the side here and there to actually work on the practice. And whether that be inside the practice or outside the practice, that's a big thing. So learning to say no to things like, I'm not going to work an extra day or an extra evening. Maybe I do need to get an associate in to work in, or maybe I do need to find an additional staff member to help here and there. So I think that'd be the first step. Yeah,
and I think that's a really important thing. I like the go slow to grow fast methodology or terminology that, we all hear. And I like the idea of stepping back. And again, one of the challenges that comes up when you talk to dentists around that is typically they worry about, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to my revenue? I can't afford to do that. And my response is, if you want to create a business beyond yourself, you can't afford not to do that. And you're right. I think that some people end up working in the business so much, they become so entrenched in it that they almost paint themselves into a bit of a corner. They just don't know how to get out of it. And so it becomes this real trap. It's like, I've got a mental blank now, the little Chinese finger traps, the harder you pull on it, the more it locks you in kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, okay. So as you've created that leverage in your practice and as you've been able to step back a little bit, saying no to a few things, as you've done that, you've freed up some time. We talk about using that time to, grow the team, develop the team, to build out the systems or the intellectual property assets of the practice. What have you found to be the best use of that time that you've freed up? So that if you're going to free up that time, it's not dead time, it's an investment for the future growth of the practice. What have you found the best investment for your time there?
I think for me personally is finding the time to be involved with other people outside the practice, Jesse. And for me, that's come in the form of business groups. As I was saying to you before, that with the average of the top 5 people that we spend time with, and I feel that the growth of the practice is limited to the growth of the leader or the practice owner. And, we need to be constantly developing in order for the practice to grow. And that could be anywhere. It could be time for you to go on CPD as an example, or time for you to go spend time with other people who have different businesses and you can get different perspectives from different industries, et cetera, et cetera. Accountants, then picking the right accountant to help you understand and analyze your practice more. I think we're very limited when we're working within those 4 walls.
Yeah. So again, I really agree with the whole concept of, the 5 people that you hang around with most are going to be the average of, where you end up. And equally, I also understand, like you, that, the business growth is limited by the growth of the leader. And we have that saying that, the bottleneck is always at the top of the bottle. And there's some truth in that. And I think as business owners, our number one job is to work on ourselves so that we can support other people and bring them up along the way as well.
Absolutely.
So, mate, you went from having the practice in Metro Melbourne, and of course we are recording this at coronavirus time. So, ladies and gents, Paul's at home as we're recording this.
Hello.
But the opportunity to came up to take the practices in the country. And of course, they're quite geographically, separate from Metro Melbourne. It's not like you've got 2 practices, down the road from each other or even in the next suburb. It's a good commute from where you are in Melbourne out to the country. So how have you been able to do that? What systems did you need to put in place? What were the key people that you had in each location? What were the systems you need to be able to have in place so that you could manage those remotely on the days that you're not there, but have confidence that things are happening in the way that they need to?
Again, that's a really good question. I guess it sounds like I had everything in place from the get-go as soon as I took over those practices 2 years ago, but that certainly wasn't the case. And, these systems came about when the problem presented itself and I had to develop from there. So I guess I want to start with that caveat. But we initially decided that, I wouldn't be going up every week. So again, set to constraints. I said I'd be going up every fortnight. And then I had to modify my books in Melbourne to accommodate that. And then I had to bring in an associate to cover those days when I was down in Melbourne so that the growth of the initial practice wasn't stunted by me taking on other practices. I didn't want to kind of just shift revenue elsewhere, and also shift problems elsewhere at the same time. So whilst I started out with owning those practices up in the country, I very quickly realized that I needed to have a system in place. And so I immediately appointed a practice manager at those particular practices. And I worked closely with them every time I was up there to kind of begin implementing systems. And because I already had a head start with the practice down in Melbourne, I guess I had a bit of a framework in terms of where I wanted those practices to head as well. So there's a lot more to that, but we'll see how we go.
Yeah. It's just like, it's a big question with a big answer. And I know we're just scratching the surface there. Yeah. So there's a ton of things in there. As you've made that transition across to put some constraints around the business, again, it just as you were saying that, it reminded me of a critical thinking question that we do a bit of critical thinking, as you know. And one of the critical thinking questions, if the audience is listening to this, you might want to just contemplate for a while. And that is, if you had to set up a business in a location that you could not visit other than once every 3 months, how would you set your business up? And if you apply that artificial constraint up front, and rather than falling into the trap of, in Paul's case, traveling to the country every week on, Thursday or Friday or whatever it could have been, and put some of those constraints in place, then you set the practice up with the outcome in mind at the very beginning. So I think there's some real wisdom in that. Apply some constraints to your thinking and to say, if I'm going to do this, what would need to be in place for me not to have to travel up every week, or so that I could only be in place once a quarter or whatever it is. So again, I really like the constraints around that. Paul, as you've gone from one practice to multiple practices, you and I both know that complexity scales. Good
and bad.
Good and bad. Totally, right? Good and bad scales, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything that you scaled that you wished you hadn't?
Oh, goodness. Could talk about this for ages. Staff is the very first thing.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Staff, there's a lot of headache in one practice alone, but when you kind of go from 1 to 4, it grows exponentially. As you said, you scale good and bad.
Yeah. And that's the thing is you went from 1 to 4, right? You didn't go 1, 2, 3, 4. You just went, it's like having triplets in your second pregnancy, It's like congratulations, guess what?
Absolutely.
Surprise. So, that's probably not a typical pathway for people to acquire 3 in one go. So for people who are thinking about doing that, would you suggest, 1 at a time? Is that something you feel strongly about, or do you just kind of feel like you evaluate each opportunity as it comes along?
I feel like you need to evaluate it on a case-by-case basis. And I think probably the better question is what do you want out of it? What are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? And what is the lifestyle that you're trying to build? That's probably the bigger and better question. That was just the opportunity that was presented to me at the time. And I was young. I had no major commitments in life. I hadn't had kids yet. And I take everything as a learning opportunity, Jesse. I feel it would vary from person to person in that regard.
I think you're right. And actually, that's a really good point that you raise, Paul, because, for some people like yourself, multiple practice ownership is the answer, right? And yet others, if their goal is different to yours, it might be having one large practice with, 8, 10 chairs under one roof.
100%.
So no one size fits all definition of success is I guess the key. All right, mate. I want to talk about having key people on your team, and I'm referring to Katie here, who is a total rock star. So Katie, if you're listening, we love you. and she's awesome. Like, she's a key member of your team, and I know that she's kind of like the group manager across all the different practices. What's the difference that she's made in having her in that role?
Oh, it's the difference between light and day, Jesse. I guess if there was one big business decision that I've made to helping to free up my time, but also make strides in development, not only for myself, but also for herself and the team, it's by identifying a second in charge, or 2IC, a right-hand person. And for me, that was Katie. Coming back to this, working in the business and on the business, Katie was a person who allowed me to work on the business even when I was working in the business. And that was mind-blowing. Big difference.
Yeah, my observation of having a right-hand person like Katie or whoever it is in your practice, if you're listening, you'll know who that is. That's a real force multiplier. That really is an accelerant. It allows you to get much more done, much more quickly, much more effectively. And the challenge that some practice owners have, I've found, is A, they might not be able to find that person so well, or B, they might not be able to hand over so well. So let's talk about the success in working with a +1. How do you see that relationship working?
So do you mean in terms of their growth, or do you mean how do they kind of complement you?
Yeah, sorry, I've just got a croaky voice just at the wrong time to finish off that question, ladies and gents. Don't mind me. Just have a little sip of water. No, I guess what I was trying to say is, how do you get the most out of that relationship? How do you work together in such a way that it's really productive and you're able to draw on each other's strengths? And together, 1 + 1 = 3.
I feel before you even start talking about how do you get the most out of it, I think the very most important thing is that they share the same vision and values that you do. your second child should really be an embodiment of the culture of the practice and be a true reflection of you in order for you to get the most out of your relationship. Yeah. I think that's the biggest thing. Secondly, in terms of trying to get the most out of that relationship is you need to schedule time to catch up with that person and you need to be involved with their growth and kind of guiding them in that principle. And Jesse, you've been a huge aspect of helping me with that as well as Katie. But certainly it's not just a matter of just going, hey, I need you to do this, I need you to do that. I think it's very important to ask them where they want to go and how they want to grow and what they want to get out of it as well. Yeah,
lovely. And again, we know that Katie is an incredible asset for your business. And not only that, she's really lovely as well. What do you think she's learned in this process? Obviously, she's learned a lot about herself. She's probably, uncovered some strengths that she may not have been aware of. But what do you think that, for someone in that +1 role, what do you think that their journey looks like?
I think if you were to ask Katie about her journey, she would tell you that she didn't know. And Katie's been in the industry for longer than I have been in the industry. She's worked at many other practices and seen what they're like. But I feel until she kind of stepped up into this role, she didn't really understand the amount of work that it took, and me too as well. A business needed to be run well. She didn't garner as much of an appreciation for how much effort and work goes into that process. So in addition to her own personal growth, she, I guess, developed a better understanding of business in light of that, and an appreciation for being involved in a part of that as well.
Yeah. All right, mate. So if we think a little bit to the future for a moment, what's the future look like for you, mate?
Jesse, I always start with the end in mind, and lifestyle is very important to me in terms of work and life balance. So for me, I guess having a family is probably something that we're going to be looking at doing sometime soon. And for me, I want to be able to be very involved with family, but also the growth of the practice at the same time. And if I was working a 9-to-5 job, Monday to Friday, that would really stop me from being able to achieve that. Yeah. So I hope that the practices continue to grow, and I feel like we've set a lot of the foundations in place to achieve that. But also it's afforded me some freedom and opportunity to achieve what I want to achieve outside the practice as well.
Yeah, and the good thing, mate, is then that your kids will grow up with, in a business like you grew up in one too. Yeah. So they'll learn from you, and they'll be able to take the family dynasty to the next level again, which is great.
Yeah, that's the hope.
Yeah. I think it's fantastic. My kids keep wanting to come and work in the business, and we're still in wage negotiations at the moment. But
is that right? I'll tell you a short story. I used to work at my dad's restaurant when I was a teenager on every school holidays, and I worked from 10 o'clock in the morning till sometimes 12 o'clock at night in midnight, and I got paid about $15-20 for that.
Nice.
It taught me just hard work.
That is really hard work. I reckon the hardest work I ever did, physical work, was when I was a uni student. We used to go to these cotton farms and do cotton shipping, and it was, like 40, 42 degree heat, and you'd be out in these fields, cotton shipping. So, and what that is you walk down the cotton field with a hoe in your hand, and you just knock out the weeds from between the cotton plants. Right. It is mind-numbingly boring, really, really hot. And by the end of the day, you're absolutely knackered. And I remember I think I was paid about $6 an hour or something, maybe like that. I can't remember, but it was pretty minimal. And all I remember thinking at the end of this is, I'm going to go back to uni and I'm going to study really hard, because I do not want to be doing this. So I reckon hard work's good for you.
Absolutely. And I think it's more so the life lessons that you get out of that.
Yeah.
More so than the actual numbers or the wage you get.
Oh, totally. So. My other job actually, Paul, sorry, this is a little off topic, but my other job was welding a vineyard. And my mate and I...
Welding a vineyard?
Yeah, like if that vineyard is standing today, it's out of St. George in Queensland. If that vineyard is standing today, I will be shocked and amazed, because I am not a welder for love nor money. But anyway, it's all those fun jobs you have. But I think you're right. I do think that those experiences set you up in ways that you don't anticipate or appreciate at the time. And there's that famous saying of Steve Jobs when he did his Stanford commencement speech, which was, you can only join the dots looking backwards, you can't join the dots looking forwards. And so
absolutely,
I wanted to ask you in that theme, as you reflect on your life, and we've touched on some of those things already, if you can join the dots now, can you see any particular pattern, or can you see how one thing led to another to another? Does that make sense as you look back now?
Yeah, I think that, I guess in terms of patterns, I guess the topic of being presented with opportunities, and I've been very fortunate to have been presented with opportunities, is that you have two ways of looking at it, Jesse. It's that you either ponder about it and you kind of go, maybe, and you think too much about it and you might even get analysis paralysis, or you just jump in and then you plan along the way. Because as the problems come along and you get to figure out the plan afterwards, I suppose. And I've always had in terms of the pattern, when the opportunity is presented to me, I just kind of jump at it.
Yeah.
I go for it. And my view in life is that you can view experience as being positive or negative. But I guess for me, it's always just an experience, because you can always learn something from it. And then, you'll make mistakes along the way, but the next time you get presented with another opportunity, you'll probably tackle it a little bit better.
Yeah. And again, the expression that you've probably heard as well is build the bike while you're riding it.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, I really like that. Just out of curiosity, that ability to spot an opportunity or to have one presented to you and to have the courage to leap, is that an innate thing in you, or is that something you observed as well? I'm just curious to understand what's nature, what's nurture.
I think that's something I've inherited from my mum.
Yeah, okay.
So I would say it's innate, because she's always had that fire and passion for business, and she's very much a go-getter. And before I had any other business mentor, and I didn't realize this until later in life, that my mum was already mentoring me from a very young age in terms of approaching things in that manner. So nice. A big shout out to my mom for that.
Yeah, happy days. That's fantastic. Yes. What a blessing. So what's the dinner time conversation at your house like?
Oh gosh, it will be endless stories from my mum, and she'll always tell us about her stories and her lessons and everything.
Yeah.
And we'll be sitting around, me and my siblings and my family, telling her, we can repeat these stories to you nonstop, but she'll constantly repeat those stories. But as funny as as funny as it sounds and as boring as, we all have those conversations around the table with family, but I feel that it's those stories that help with my growth significantly, and just that repetition and understanding.
I think it's also creating legacy, mate, for what it's worth. Absolutely. I think, please, I don't mean this to sound morbid, but
no,
when the time comes and your mum's not around anymore, you'll have those stories forever. And I'm sure
yes.
Yeah, when your kids arrive, you'll be telling the same stories over and over and over and over and over to your kids.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And that's how, Jesse, it was funny. I was having this conversation with my wife the other day about this very topic, and it was at dinner actually, about how we pass on and build on that legacy. And it's through stories, that culture telescope that you always talk about vision and values, and then, rituals and behaviors. Story is what brings it all together.
It's the connection.
And I think an important part about being a business owner is about becoming a great storyteller. And that's something that I've just happened to learn and been grateful to have been taught and learned along the way. And I think that's a big thing for everyone to know as well.
All right, mate. Well, just as we wrap up, any words of wisdom from Mum that you think the audience might benefit from Mrs. Hwin?
If Mrs. Hwin was here, she'd say, don't think too much and just jump in and do it and solve it later. But otherwise, we'll be here for another half an hour.
There you go. All right.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, mate, I've really enjoyed having the opportunity to talk to you, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share your insights, your lessons with the audience here at Savvy Dentist. And as you know, we talk a lot about scaling and what it means to different people, and I think, you've done a great job at multi-practice ownership, and I think, you've handled yourself and the opportunities that have been presented to you, really, really well. I just want to acknowledge that and salute you for the fantastic work that you've done and continue to do, and for your generosity of sharing your insights and lessons, some of them hard won along the way, no doubt, but I really appreciate your generosity of spirit to come on and share those with us today.
Thank you so much, Jesse. It's been an honor.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green. For more free tools and resources, join the free Facebook group. Visit drjessegreen.com/Facebook. And for more episodes, visit drjessegreen.com/savvydentist.